Donald Trump returns from Paris to find himself in a political firestorm. Could firing the nation's top cop lead to the president's downfall? I'm Adnan Nawaz, and today's newsmaker is Jeff Sessions. Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions campaigned for Donald Trump when most Republicans considered the reality TV star a joke. And it was the loyalty shown by Sessions that got him a top job in the president's cabinet. But the honeymoon as Attorney General ended quickly as Sessions recused himself from an investigation into possible collusion with the Kremlin because he had met Russian officials during the campaign. That decision provoked Trump's wrath. It continued to do so as lead investigator Robert Mueller got convictions against Trump's former national security advisor, campaign chairman, and personal lawyer. Now that the president has installed an acting attorney general, one who has spoken publicly against the Russian investigation, will that end the Trump family's legal woes? Or could it be a desperate move to keep the house of cards from falling? Here's Sandra Gatman.
Jeff Sessions is out. The former U.S. Attorney General now joins a long list of top officials booted out by Donald Trump in his first 2 years as president. Sessions' firing relates to the ongoing investigation by Robert Mueller into whether Russia meddled in Trump's presidential campaign in 2016. Jeff Sessions initially denied ever meeting Russian officials, but it was later revealed he had 2 encounters with the Russian ambassador to Washington. When Sessions recused himself from the investigation last year, Trump saw it as betrayal.
I'm disappointed in the Attorney General. He should not have recused himself almost immediately after he took office. And if he was going to recuse himself, he should have told me prior to taking office.
With Sessions gone, Trump has appointed Matthew Whitaker, a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Iowa. But there are doubts about Whitaker's ties to Trump. The president has issued contradicting statements about how well the two know each other.
I don't know Matt Whitaker. Matt Whitaker worked for Jeff Sessions, and he was always extremely highly thought of, and he still is.
There are questions, too, about whether Whitaker's appointment is even legal. Usually, it's the Attorney General's deputy who takes his place, in this case, Rod Rosenstein. For Trump's critics, the concern is that Sessions' firing and Whitaker's appointment are moves to obstruct the Mueller investigation. Many Americans worry the Mueller probe is in danger.
No excuse, must recuse.
I think there can be no debate that he is a stooge, a crony of Trump. There can be no integrity, no independence to this investigation with someone like that overseeing it.
And there's reason to believe that. Whitaker has openly advocated ways to undercut funding.
I could see a scenario where Jeff Sessions is replaced with a recess appointment, and that Attorney General doesn't fire Bob Mueller, but he just reduces his budget so low that his investigation grinds to almost a halt.
Whitaker has also argued that the Russia inquiry should not investigate Trump's family business. In an opinion piece for CNN, he wrote,
"Investigating Donald Trump's finances or his family's finances falls completely outside of the realm of his 2016 campaign and the allegations that the campaign coordinated with the Russian government or anyone else. That goes beyond the scope of the appointment of the special counsel."
But critics say there's evidence that Trump's businesses, which include his 2 sons, were never entirely separated from his campaign. Democrats, newly empowered by their majority win in the House of Representatives, say Whitaker is unfit to oversee the investigation.
I think that he should recuse himself for any review of the investigation because of statements he has made already in the public domain.
As for Mueller, he's already begun penning his report. The question is when and if those findings will come to light, and whether the next Attorney General will allow the president and those around him to be prosecuted if they're found to have colluded with Russia to get Trump into power. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
To discuss this, we're joined in San Diego, California by former U.S. Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman. And in the French city of Rennes is Mark Porter. He is the president of Republicans Overseas France. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on The Newsmakers. Harry, has this firing of Jeff Sessions actually created more problems for Donald Trump than leaving him in place?
Wow, that's hard to say. I mean, it could blow up in his face. There's been a huge torrent of criticism of Whitaker, both as to his credentials, which are spare in the extreme, and more importantly, to his pre-existing alliance with the president. The idea is certainly to reduce the problems. The idea is certainly to install someone who will ride herd on the Mueller probe. If he's able to succeed in that goal, no, it will overall reduce the hot water he is in. But right now, that outcome is in doubt because the pushback has been ferocious.
Mark, what do you make of that? Harry says ride herd over the Mueller probe. It seems Harry's saying that specifically Sessions has been fired because there wasn't the oversight that Donald Trump wanted on the Mueller investigation.
Well, not necessarily that, but of course, Attorney General Sessions has a completely different type of personality than the president. The president needs someone now that can take care of him in terms of making sure that the Mueller investigation is done properly. They have certainly a large scope of what they're able to investigate in these things. And the point that Attorney General Sessions had recused himself because of a trap that was set during the confirmation hearings always set really badly with the president. So the idea that Attorney General Sessions during the confirmation hearings had said that he had never met with a Russian ambassador, when in fact he had simply interpreted that as by saying that he had never sat down, had a meeting with him. When it turned out some of the campaign staffers on other campaigns came forward and said that they had a photograph of him shaking the ambassador's hand. That's not exactly meeting with someone, but Sessions, who's a very honorable man, decided to step down and recuse himself in order to avoid any perceived conflict. That was seen, of course, by the president as an error.
Yeah, but Mark, sorry, hold on. Haven't you just answered your own question? You've said that Attorney General Sessions is an honorable man, and when it turned out that he had met with Russian diplomats, that surely would be reason enough to recuse him from the investigation, because it would surely make him appear not to be impartial. Are you saying that the president would prefer loyalty over impartiality? It made sense to so many people that he would recuse himself.
No, it didn't really make sense to a lot of people. And the idea that you meet with someone, in fact, that was what the line of questioning was intended to do, was to trap Jeff Sessions. Meeting with someone and meeting someone are two different things. And Sessions just simply said, well, in order to clarify the situation, he would step down and move forward. What we've seen, in fact, is the investigation has been rather abusive. It's gone after people that are completely innocent. They have destroyed people's lives. They've cost hundreds of thousands of dollars of people that had nothing to do with this. There is no Russian collusion. This is absolutely ridiculous. So, of course, Trump, at this particular time, the president would like to see this wrapped up, see what Mueller does have in his investigation, what he has come up with, get the report out so that we can see that there's nothing there and we can move on and help the people of America, the U.S.
Harry, anything to say about that?
Yes, quite a bit. First of all, rule number one with Mueller is you know, Mark has no basis for making that claim. Everything we know that Mueller has alleged so far has proven to be 100% solid gold. There have been conviction after conviction after conviction of higher-up folks. The more important point, I do think both you and Mark answered it. Excuse me, Mr. Porter, I'll be done in a moment. Did answer it. It's exactly as you say, and it's quite evident. Mark says he needs someone to take care of the investigation. You say, does he value loyalty over impartiality? It's quite evident that he does. And remember, he is a criminal suspect. It's completely irregular and improper to install a probe somebody who is looking out for the interests of the president rather than looking out for the interests of justice. That's what is so unnerving about the move. Finally, on the recusal of Sessions, Sessions went to the professional staff in the Department of Justice. They advised him he has to recuse. There's not an attorney general who's ever served who would disregard that information until now, Matt Whitaker. He's made it clear that even if the professional staff tells him he must recuse, he's not going to. That is mind-bending.
Okay, Mark.
What's mind-bending is the fact that Loretta Lynch and Eric Holder were also under investigation. They also didn't appear at congressional committees. So this is ridiculous to say that Jeff Sessions would be somehow different, an anomaly here, and that the president doesn't have the right to do this. He's the president of the United States. He is the boss of the Justice Department. We have these rules that we follow, and this idea that everyone is out on a witch hunt trying to find things. Every indictment that was done by Mueller had to do with something completely irrelevant, completely different than the original investigation. There's no scope of the investigation. It's completely run amok. It's a witch hunt.
Okay, let's move on to the new man in charge, Jeff Whitaker.
So that's
Harry, go ahead. Sure. Go ahead, Harry. Okay. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say once again, of course, many of the indictments are dead center within the sights of the Russian investigation, and the focus right now has been quite properly on obstruction. Yes, he's the president. Yes, he's the head of the Department of Justice. So was Richard Nixon. So, in fact, was Bill Clinton when I was in the Department of Justice. It's 100% clear that when the president occupies those dual roles, he cannot reach out and try to influence things. Imagine if Bill Clinton had installed Hillary Clinton as Attorney General under the pretext, well, I have a right to have my person there. It's just not how the justice system can work in a democracy.
Okay, let's please now look at the new man in charge, Matthew Whitaker. Mark, should he recuse himself? He has been speaking in public on American television against the Russian investigation before he became Attorney General, acting Attorney General. He's even talked about specific points that he would employ to end the investigation. That seems to be obstruction of justice and certainly some kind of pre-based opinion before getting the job, and how that might affect the oversight of the Mueller investigation.
There's no obstruction of justice. This is a smokescreen that the Democrats have been trying to use for a long time. They certainly weren't screaming that around Loretta Lynch when she met with President Clinton on that airplane out on that tarmac. All of a sudden, the rules change here. With the Justice Department, the president is the boss of the Justice Department. There is no obstruction. That's just a legal maneuver in order to help Democrats have a founding here. This idea that Eric Holder was under investigation for gun running across the Mexican border, these things should still be investigated, and we're wasting our time with something that never happened. Russian collusion was set up by the DNC, the Democratic National Convention Committee. They were out with the Michael Steele dossier trying to create this ridiculous story that everyone is saying is not true. Mueller's got to write up his report. Let's see what's in there, because no one knows at this point, and move on so that we can help the American people.
Okay, let's wait for the denouement, the end game of the Mueller investigation before we make statements about whether there's been collusion or not. We understand that the two sides have different opinions. Harry, let me ask you this. What are the legal means that Matthew Whitaker may have?
May I just respond to what Mark just said?
Sure.
Okay. I just wanted to say, Mark, I think you've expressed views quite like those of Matt Whitaker. Do you feel that if you were in charge of the investigation, there would be some basis for thinking maybe you're not impartial? That's the issue with recusal. If you have someone who has these very strong views, as you do, as Matt Whitaker does, the public obviously would have basis for believing that you've already prejudged the matter. That's what we're talking about. Same standard for anybody, Loretta Lynch, Jeff Sessions, and now Matt Whitaker.
That's a ridiculous premise to put forward.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is a ridiculous premise to put forward. This idea that the Justice Department is in charge of the investigation. The president is the head of the Justice Department. He can put in who he likes. The Mueller investigation is an independent special counsel. This is very clear. They have an unlimited budget. They have unlimited staff. So they've had over a year and a half, and so far they haven't come forward with anything except indictments that have nothing to do with their original mandate.
Mark, do you think that Mueller's going to be fired before the investigation is complete?
You're simply wrong as a matter of law. If you were right, Richard Nixon would not have had to resign.
Okay, Mark.
It's just mistaken, Mark, in your legal analysis.
Okay, again, you're not going to agree on that point. What about the possibility, Mark, what about the possibility of Mueller being fired before his investigation is complete? Do you think it's possible?
I don't know what's possible, but I do know that we are waiting for the report to come out. I know that Mueller has said that he's going to put out a report, and we're waiting to see what's in it.
Apparently, he's writing it right now. Harry, what are the legal means available to Matthew Whitaker to hamper the Mueller investigation if he wanted to do that? What's within his power?
Sure. I mean, he has extensive power now as the supervisor. He controls, although he's still bound by law and regulations, so he controls budget. He controls any expansion of the jurisdiction. He can actually second-guess a particular investigative move by Mueller, although it has to be for very strong reason, and he has to give heavy deference to special counsel. And then finally, on this report that Mark mentions, he actually would have great authority to decide what happens to it, how widely it's disseminated. And remember, Team Trump, and he is part of Team Trump, that's why he's there now, has already said they would like not to see it made public. So he would have a lot of authority there. And in all of these points, of course, it would be impossible for wherever you are on this question, you have to recognize it's in the public interest to have a full investigation that people can have confidence in. And if you have somebody astride it who's able to actually suppress it, people are just not going to feel that way. It's just self-evident.
Mark?
How do you know what people are going to feel? This is ridiculous. This idea that Mueller's part of Team Trump, but he can't fire him, you're playing both sides of the cards here. This is a typical Democratic strategy that doesn't work, and the people know.
No, I'm sorry. Mueller's not part of Team Trump. Whitaker's part of Team Trump. That's why he's there. He's the eyes and ears, in his own words, of the president here.
Okay, you know what?
And remember, the president is a criminal suspect.
Okay, just in the last few minutes, can I just widen it a little bit further? Mark, there are accusations that Donald Trump has been politicizing the application of law in the United States to suit his own purposes. You're already shaking your head, but let me just take you back to just a couple of weeks ago, okay? Because Newt Gingrich was doing a live interview.
I'm shaking my head.
Right, okay. Newt Gingrich was doing a live interview. He was asked by the interviewer, what will happen if Congress subpoenas Donald Trump to show his tax returns? I want to get this quote right because this was Gingrich's response. He said, then they'll be trapped into appealing to the Supreme Court and we'll see whether or not the Kavanaugh fight was worth it. That seems to be Newt Gingrich saying that Kavanaugh was nominated to the Supreme Court by the President of the United States to serve and protect Donald Trump's interests.
No, what we're trying to do is to get to the truth here. And we know that the whole Russia investigation began.
This is a different question now. Mark, seriously, a different question. This is about Donald Trump, the accusation that he's politicizing the application of American law. That one quote from Newt Gingrich was like a bombshell in the United States, wasn't it? Because if he's saying that if Trump is subpoenaed to show his tax returns, we'll see if the fight for Kavanaugh to be nominated to the Supreme Court was worth it, that's an incredible statement.
I haven't talked to Newt recently, and I haven't heard the quotes, so I don't know in what context he's talking about. So that's one statement. I would like to talk to Newt before I make a comment on that. Because simply the idea that if this goes to the Supreme Court over the president's tax returns, this is another witch hunt, just like the Russia investigation.
Okay, Harry, I think it's the last word to you. How do you just see the whole way Trump is protecting himself against the various investigations? We haven't even come to what's happened in the Southern District of New York and the findings from the New York Times about the hush money being paid to a male film actress, all of that stuff. But Trump is under investigation for so many different things. He's under pressure, but he's surviving. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I mean, it is really wide-ranging, and among his partisans, like Mark, you hear on the one hand, we want the truth out. On the other, this is all witch hunt. There's nothing there, and a sense of having prejudged it. It will be really critical whether Whitaker. Please, Mr. Porter. It'll be really critical whether or not Whitaker stays in. But, you know, Bob Mueller is in a very interesting position. On the one hand, he is a good soldier. He respects chain of command. On the other, his whole life has been about rule of law and accountability and public corruption. All the values he spent his life for are obviously endangered by this most dangerous and really abusive president probably in our history, and whether he will fight or just salute if there is, in fact, some kind of attempt to suppress his investigation is hard to predict in advance. But certainly here, it doesn't sound like it in France, but certainly here, everyone is watching and very worried because Trump has shown himself again and again to really think basically only about Trump.
Mark, do you want to reply to that?
Well, clearly that's a very political statement, this idea that Trump is the worst president ever, that everything is horrible because Trump is president. When our economy is growing, the people have faith in him, as we saw in the midterm elections. This is quite ridiculous to say this. Only people within the Beltway are talking about these sorts of things. We will move on. The Republic is stronger than this. Harry clearly is a partisan out there working for the Democratic Party. I can congratulate him on that. The midterms weren't that bad for him. But this whole idea is there was no Russian collusion. We know that innocent people have been chased down and hunted down like witches, and this is what I'm referring to. So this idea of going after innocent people to suppress a political party. Please, Harry, you had your turn. Now, the idea here is
name one innocent person. You're right.
Are you kidding? I have a whole list of them. Do you know how many people have been chased after, had to pay their own legal bills after all of the Mueller investigation is done with an unlimited budget, with no real mandate? They can go after anyone they want. And until now, none of the indictments have had anything to do with this supposedly Russia investigation.
Name one innocent person.
J.B. Gordon, number one. I've got a whole list. I just did. I've got a whole list of them. So provoking into this is ridiculous. You know that you're being partisan. You know that you're out there trying to twist and do anything possible to remove the president when the people have clearly spoken. So, Harry, I'm really sorry. Perhaps in a year or so, we can have a conversation after the report comes out, and then we'll see the people have moved on. America is a strong republic. The people deserve better than this.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Mark and Harry, really appreciate it.
We can definitely agree there. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Coming up, kidnapped in Cameroon. We'll discuss why gunmen took these students hostage and then released them. And is the United States trying to make peace with Turkey by putting a bounty on 3 senior members of the PKK?
Despite what happened here, the state government will not surrender.
There's a whodunit mystery surrounding the kidnapping of 78 boys and girls in northwestern Cameroon. The children, aged between 11 and 17, were released last week after gunmen took them from their boarding school. The government has accused a group of English-speaking separatists for the abductions. But the government's claim is being challenged by our guest, Mark Barretta. He is a pro-separatist activist who runs the website Barretta News. He says the government was involved in the kidnapping. And in London, we have counter-terrorism specialist David Otto. Thanks to both of you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Let's first try to get to the bottom of who did this. David, is there any, so far, credible evidence that suggests we know exactly who carried out this kidnapping?
So far, we do not have any credible evidence to show who actually carried out the kidnap. But what I want to mention is that we have 2 incidents of kidnaps that took place within a couple of 3 days. On the 30th of October 2018, the Presbyterian Church in Cameroon reported that 11 students had been kidnapped from that same school, which is PSS Mancom. And the principal and the moderator of Cameroon actually said they had then negotiated a ransom deal, unfortunately, with an Ambazonian group, a group that claimed that, you know, they were from the Ambazonia separatist forces. Then 4 days after that, which was on the 4th of November, another 78 students and 3 staffs were taken away from the same school. This time, the group that took them claimed that they rescued them, that they were the Ambazonian forces, and they rescued them from the hands of the military. So we have the Ambazonians accusing the military, the Cameroon government and the Cameroon military of organizing a kidnap to which they rescued the students on one hand. Then we have other separatist groups saying they were responsible for the kidnap of the 11 students that had been released earlier. So, there is no clear evidence at the moment who actually carried out the kidnap. But we've only seen the students in the hands of the Ambazonia forces and not in the hands of any government militias. Because, again, that brings one to the conclusion, from the evidence that the Ambazonian gave, that if they didn't have the capacity to actually carry out a kidnap, but the question is, how did they have the capacity to rescue the students and then take the students from where they had been rescued to deliver them where they had been delivered without the same capacity? So at the moment, we don't know who really did it, but every finger points at the evidence, every evidence points at the Ambazonia separatist movement rather than the government.
Okay, Mark, what do you think about that?
I think that this reasoning is flawed, because we hear the moderator of the PCC who told us on the 5th of November that a group of armed gunmen took some 11 students on the 30th of October. But we are shocked because when that happened, none of us were aware. There was no news out there that 11 students had been taken, and it only came to the forefront on the 4th of November that 2 different types of kidnap had been done. And it should be recalled that we, the activists, the Ambazonian interim government, and all frontline groups, they have before now condemned all acts of kidnap. And I want to focus on the first video. I'm sure that you must have watched the first video. There's someone with a beard, and I take particular note at the language. In Southern Cameroon, we speak Pidgin English, and even when our local vernacular will have to interfere with how we speak Pidgin English, that particular person who spoke that type of Pidgin English is not from any part of the Southern Cameroons. As per the second video, where we had more than 78 students being kidnapped, Ambazonians fighters, they do not have the capacity to take students from a school that large and take them to their camp. And I want us to be recalled that we have raised alarm before now that there are fake guys, there are fake militias around that the government has implanted to carry out acts just to tarnish the image of the revolution, to tarnish the image of the self-defense forces, what we call Amba Boys, out here in the international community. Yes.
Okay, we have to look at the bigger picture here, okay? Because for people observing from outside Cameroon, it's quite clear that these 2 cases of the kidnappings are using children as pawns in what appears to be a propaganda war. Okay, we know that there's a secessionist movement in the English-speaking part of the country that wants to separate from Paul Biya's control of the French-speaking part of the country. So, David, first of all, tell us how serious this secessionist movement is.
It is very serious indeed. And if the government of Cameroon doesn't actually come to the negotiation table to either decide on whether there has to be a federal state or there has to be a referendum, then, we would see this Ambazonian movement moving for another 30 years. At the moment, the groups have acquired a serious amounts of weapons. The government was supposed to negotiate this crisis for a very long time. A lot of people international communities, people from Cameroon have called for the government to actually come to the table and address the key issues that these movements have raised. But what the government has done is they've given a blind eye and they've just turned their heads elsewhere. The international community has done the same. People are dying in masses. They are being killed by both military forces and the so-called separatist forces. So it is a very serious problem. It would affect the Central Africa region. It would affect Cameroon seriously. If the government doesn't negotiate with this movement, as the president says, then we would see another massacre that will take place. And if we're not careful, that region will be wiped out.
Okay, Mark, you are a secessionist. You describe yourself as an activist. Has President Paul Biya shown any willingness to talk with the separatists?
Well, I think that I am a separatist, or you better call it a restorationist. Mr. Biya has shown no willingness to dialogue or to negotiate with those who are clamoring for the independence of the former British Southern Cameroons. We have heard severally that he has addressed us as terrorists, and he has made it clear that he doesn't negotiate or dialogue with the terrorists. But we have been open. We have been open. I think every frontline movement, the interim government, they have issued statements and have said we are open to negotiate with the regime of Paul Biya on the root cause of how the two Cameroons came together. And we are waiting, and we are hoping that the international community would they would take the case of the American missionary who was shot last 2 weeks in Birmingham, and the recent case of using kids as bait, because we have said that churches, schools, and hospitals in war zone are no-go areas. So we hope that the international community can rise and push Biya on the dialogue table.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Really appreciate it. The United States and Turkey have been at odds over the global economy, the detention of an American pastor, and the harbouring of the man Ankara believes is behind a failed coup in Turkey. Now the US appears to have made a peace offering. Last week, the American government announced awards of up to $5 million each for information on 3 senior leaders of the PKK terror group. So is Washington's move enough to mend ties between the two NATO allies? Haider Abbasi reports.
Sometimes it's hard to tell if Turkey and the United States are friends. Their relationship seemed to reach the breaking point earlier this year, with the US even imposing sanctions on its NATO ally. But are relations finally improving? Washington is now offering a combined reward of up to $12 million for these men. Murat Karailan, Cemil Bayik, and Duran Kalkan are all leaders of the outlawed PKK. Since 1984, Turkey's been fighting PKK terrorists on its soil and elsewhere. Around 40,000 people have been killed in the conflict. Turkey has praised the bounty, but wants more from the US, especially when it comes to the PKK's Syrian affiliate, the YPG.
Although this is a positive step by our friends and allies from the US, I want to underline that this has been a late step. We expect them to take the same stance against the terrorists of the YPG and the PKK, which is the same organization. It is impossible for us to accept that on one hand, the US is sending weapons and ammunition to the YPG, and on the other hand, they are offering rewards for information on senior members of the PKK.
Ankara wants the US to cut all ties with the YPG. Since 2014, the group has received money, training, and weapons from Washington. The YPG's cozy relationship with the Americans has strained US relations with Turkey, but things have improved elsewhere. Last month, a Turkish court's decision to release American pastor Andrew Brunson brought some relief. Brunson was arrested in 2016, accused by Ankara of having links to Fethullah Gulen. Ankara blames Gulen for planning a coup attempt in the same year. Brunson's detention led to the US imposing sanctions on Turkey's interior and justice ministers. Turkey's economy also suffered as relations with the US worsened. But those sanctions have now been lifted, and the US says Turkey will still be able to trade with Iran, despite new sanctions from Washington. But will this be enough to normalize relations between Turkey and the United States? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now, and we'll begin here in the studio with the former AK Party MP Talip Küçükcan, who is now a senior fellow at the TRT World Research Center. Talip, thank you very much indeed. And remotely from Ankara, we're joined by Faruk Laolu. He's a Turkish diplomat and the country's former ambassador to Washington. In Miami, Florida for us, Peter Galbraith is there. Peter is a former US ambassador. He's also the author of The End of Iraq. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. As it's an American initiative from the State Department, Peter, let's start with you. Why do you think it's happened now? The PKK has been designated by the State Department as a terrorist organization since 1997.
Let's start with the fact that it's unusual to put a bounty on the heads of all groups that are designated as terrorist organizations. So this was an unusual move. I presume it was basically a political decision in the context of improving U.S.-Turkey relations, the release of Andrew Brunson, and to mollify Turkey over the continued American support for the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria.
Very interesting. Faruk, what do you think? Will it work? Will the American appeasement with this decision on these three PKK leaders satisfy Ankara in terms of improving relations?
I hope it will not satisfy Ankara, because it is the U.S. action is basically a meaningless gimmick. It is the PKK has been on their terrorist list for decades now, for several decades, and they know exactly where these three terrorists are. If they really wanted to capture them, they could have done so without much effort and so easily until now. But I think the assumptions lying behind their action is, as you said, to appease Turkey, and I hope Turkey will not be appeased and will not lend much credence to this act. The basic assumption, I think, U.S. assumption, is that in order for them to sustain their presence in Syria, they have to work with the Kurds, and only the Kurds. I think this really leads to undermining the territorial integrity and independence of Syria. And I think the U.S. should have to develop a much wiser, a much better, a more comprehensive policy of supporting Syrian independence and territorial integrity. And whatever reasons they have for staying in Syria, it has to be based on those parameters. But perhaps one last observation in this regard is that I think given President Trump's outlook regarding Iran, Syria is simply a jumping board for President Trump's policies vis-a-vis Iran. That too is, I think, is wrong and is not wise.
Peter, you hear there an analysis from Turkey, and many people here in this country regard this as a much wider issue than just these three PKK terrorist leaders. What do you think of that allegation? It's almost an accusation, isn't it, towards the American government that, look, if you wanted to find these three people, you're allied with the YPG, which is the Syrian arm of the PKK, pretty much admitted, you could even include the Syrian Democratic Forces in that, pretty much admitted by high-ranking American generals, that they're all one and the same. And that if the Americans wanted these three men, they could get them immediately. Just ask someone in the YPG.
Well, first, I agree with Ambassador Laolu that this is a gimmick. Undoubtedly, somebody in the State Department or the White House had a list of things that they could give Turkey, and this was on the list, and it was an easy one to do. I don't think anybody seriously thinks that in the U.S. that the problem of the PKK is going to be solved militarily. There was a peace process between Turkey and the PKK. That needs to be resumed. I don't think it's quite so easy to go snatch these three because they're in Kandil Mountain. Turkey's operating there. Obviously, Turkey's been unable to snatch them either. So I think that's a separate point. But I agree that it's a gimmick. Now, coming to Syria, you have the SDF or YPG, the Syrian Kurds, who have been the most effective force in fighting the Islamic State anywhere in the theater. And so that was the basis of the U.S. decision to support them back in 2014. And it is part of the continuing support. There's a humanitarian issue in the sense that there's a significant population there that would be at risk if either the Islamic State or the Syrian government were to retake the area. And from the point of view of the Trump administration, they see that that Assad is Iran's ally, and so we have a policy of great hostility toward Iran. So they don't want Assad's ally to have all of Syria. The irony, of course, is that in Iraq they do just the opposite. They support Iran's ally, which is the government in Baghdad, against the Iraqi Kurds, who have been very pro-American and who have had good relations with Turkey. So it's a, shall we say, a confused American policy.
So, okay, Talib, we have now here also Iraq mentioned, Iran mentioned, Syria mentioned. You're, until very recently, a member of parliament for President Erdogan's AK party. Has President Erdogan ever offered the Americans assistance that would sidestep the YPG and say, don't use this terror group as your battering ram against Daesh in Syria? We, the Turkish people, the Turkish army, will do that job with you.
Well, actually, when the Obama administration hinted that they were going to work with PYD and YPG in order to combat Daesh terrorism, Turkey openly offered help and assistance and cooperation in that region. Because the rise of non-state actors in the Middle East, in Syria in particular, caused a chaos. Now we see the consequences of that chaos from a humanitarian point of view, from a security point of view, etc. And unfortunately, the US government decided to go ahead with the PYD and YPG, which is an existential threat to Turkey's national security. Given the length of borders, given the activities of this organization in the Syrian case, Turkey was very careful right from the beginning that supporting PYD and YPG is also supporting regional havoc. And that's, I think, what happened in the region. We strongly believe that the US, I think, failed to address Turkey's concerns, given the fact that Daesh and also PYD and YPG were active. Remember that Turkey was very active in the coalition against the Daesh, fighting Daesh coalition. Turkish soldiers, as well as our Incirlik Air Base was used. You can see that Turkey was willing to fight any kind of terrorist organization. However, US has chosen to support PYD and YPG to fight Daesh. Whereas Turkish army was prepared, we are talking about a regular army, the second biggest military force in the NATO, but unfortunately the US, which is a traditional Turkish ally, did not accept that offer on the table. And I think now just, I think, putting reward on 3 PKK leaders will not really justify US policies in the region.
And then now these joint patrols between Turkish military and the American military around the town of Manbij have begun. Are they also a distraction from the Americans to finally consent to the Turkish request to do that? For so many months, the Turks were saying, let us please be involved here because of the YPG presence around Manbij.
I think American administration has some contradictions. Time to time, if you look at the reports, if you look at the, for example, discourse and rhetoric of the Syrian envoy today, in the past he used to say PYD and YPG is a branch of PKK, which is a terrorist organization recognized by the NATO, European Union, plus United States of America. So US has not been very clear, actually, in this line concerning northern Syria. But Turkey made it very clear that we do not want to have any threat in our border. It is not maybe the exact analogy, but when you talk about Al-Qaeda, the US really used all its forces in order to eradicate the threat, which was a national threat to the United States of America. Turkey sees the existence and presence of PYD and YPG as an existential threat to its own security, and Turkey will do everything in its own capacity. Remember that Turkey had two cross-border operations. One was against Daesh, one was against the PKK related PYD and YPG. Two of them were very successful, and Turkey decided to go ahead in Manbij on its own if necessary. And I think this was one of the breaking points that the US now understands that Turkey has the capacity on its own, has the willingness, and also there is a huge public support within Turkey to go after PYD and YPG. And it is a cross-national consensus, cross-ideological consensus. All political parties except HDP supports Turkey's engagement because Turkey would like to see a secure border where also some 3.5 million Syrian refugees might go back to their own countries. There is also that dimension of the problems that we are talking today.
Farouk, how much credibility is there in this theory in some circles in Turkey that the United States is actually working against Ankara? You had mentioned the wider terms of this whole one particular issue of the PKK terrorists, because there is a theory, is there not, that the United States is trying to join the north of Iraq and the north of Syria. And when you look at the Middle Eastern map, that would create a long, long corridor along Turkey's southern border. Is there any credibility in that theory at all amongst people who make decisions in Turkey?
Well, I think there are two parts to the answer to this question. The first part is that the U.S. is not working against Turkey. The second part is about this extensive corridor from the north of Iraq through the north of Syria all the way to the Mediterranean. It does hold some water, but I think if you look at the discourse of any of the powers in the region or outside the region, they all talk about the territorial integrity, independence, sovereignty of both Iraq and Syria. And I think we have to take that at face value. We have to believe that. The problem is, I think, as you talk about protecting, preserving the independence, territorial integrity, whatnot, of these two states in the region, you are at the same time working at cross purposes because you want to maintain your presence there. What for? I mean, I think once you bring peace and stability to these countries, everybody has to leave. The U.S. must leave. Turkey must leave. Russia must leave. All other powers, Iran must leave. Certainly, Iran must leave, and leave these countries to their own means to live in peace, security, and stability. I think, to answer your question more directly, is the United States, after constituting, establishing, or helping the foundation of an independent Kurdish state in Iraq and in Syria, and perhaps extending to other neighboring countries in the region, my answer would be definitely no. They cannot do this. No force, no power in the world can establish an independent Kurdish state in that region. Everybody would be against it. The Turks, the Iranians, the Arabs, and others will all be opposing this, and that would really put the region into an infinite turmoil.
Okay, so no independent Kurdish state necessarily, Peter, but can you see a point where the United States will ditch the YPG? The PYD, the political wing of the YPG, has issued a statement against these rewards for these three PKK men. Is there an end game here in terms of the relationship between Washington and the YPG?
First, I think we perhaps might...
I think when the time comes,
how all this came about. One has to remember, in 2014, Kobani was being besieged. Turkey had tanks on its side of the border, right overlooking the town as the Islamic State was closing in, and Turkey did nothing. And that's why the Obama administration intervened, first with airstrikes and then with delivery of weapons to the YPG, because Turkey wouldn't act. And secondly, this outrage I hear about dealing with the YPG. I'm sorry, but I have to say, Salih Muslim, the head of the PYD, was in Ankara, in Turkey. He was meeting with Turkish officials. So I don't understand how the sudden discovery that he was somehow PKK was made, I guess, after 2015 or 2016. There's an element of politics on the Turkish side, as there is obviously in this bounty also a gimmick. I don't think that, I was in Kobani incidentally afterwards. The devastation was appalling, and so I'm very proud that the United States intervened when Turkey wouldn't act. Turkey could have acted. In terms of any greater plan for a greater Kurdistan, that's not in U.S. strategy. I believe sooner or later Iraqi Kurdistan will become independent because they voted 93% for independence, and I hope that will happen. But to suggest that Iraqi Kurdistan and the Syrian Kurds are going to form a corridor, one has to understand the intense hostility between the governments in those two places. They may be Kurdish, but they're not at all allies.
Okay, Peter,
when we look at the Kurdish problem, you need to have different solutions in different places. And in Turkey, there needs to be a peace process, which President Erdogan started and unfortunately abandoned.
We have run out of time. Gentlemen, all three of you, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Adnan Nawaz. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, could Theresa May's Brexit deal be on the verge of collapse after she cancels talks with her own cabinet? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.